In this video, we will be covering some of the strangest, most unknown facts about the US Civil War, from certain secret weapons that were made, to certain legal loopholes they used, to the first ever case of a man pleading temporary insanity for murdering someone, to the non-human Confederate soldiers, and exploring the real reason behind the US Civil War, and so much more. Incredible missions and battles, some insane US Civil War era spy work. Yeah, there's quite a lot in here, but we will be exploring all of that, so grab a drink. My choice today is just plain water for once, and join me as we explore the US Civil War Iceberg. In Tier 1, we have the Gatling Gun. So, a little known fact, the Gatling Gun was actually invented by Richard Gatling, which that's not a joke, by the way. He invented it during the US Civil War in 1961, and it basically looked like this. It could fire around 200 to 400 rounds a minute, which compared to the rifles at the time, which were firing around 1 to 2 rounds per minute, the Gatling gun design was just absolutely revolutionary. But it didn't see much use until much later on, later in the years. It wasn't as widespread. The early versions of this were kind of clunky. They were a little bit ineffective. And strangely, the inventor of this, Dr. Richard Jordan Gatling, he didn't necessarily create the gun to be more effective on the battlefield, but he did say that he invented it to basically reduce the size of armies. And so if one man could fire the equivalent amount of rounds that, 100 men could in 1 minute, then in theory, the army sizes needed to be a lot fewer, a lot smaller, and each side could fight wars with fewer and fewer men. And then if each army had fewer men, then naturally less men would die in the wars, and the areas, the barracks and all that, they would be less cramped, less crowded, and less soldiers would die from stuff like disease. So the reasoning for this invention was kind of a little bit strange, but it did actually, when you think about it, make a little bit of sense. King Cotton. So this was kind of two things. It was the name that the Confederacy gave themselves kind of unofficially, because they were the largest producer and exporter of cotton in the world at the time. And also, this was a strategy used by the Confederate States before and during the Civil War. Because, as I said, half of all of US exports before the Civil War was cotton, and the US supplied almost all of Britain and France's cotton to them, with around 80% of Britain's and 90 or 95% of France's cotton coming directly from the United States. And this was obviously all from the southern states. And so when the South seceded, they did kind of like a self-embargo. So they blocked themselves from selling to Europe, and this was kind of in an attempt to, drown out Europe or create a cotton famine for them. And this, in the Confederates' mind, would force Britain and France to come to the aid of the Confederacy. But this strategy didn't really work. Britain, for example, simply found new suppliers from around the world, namely India and Egypt. And there's also another very crazy story about Britain and Egypt and cotton, which we won't get into right now. We'll cover further down in the iceberg. But yeah, some of the southern politicians at the time, like for example Senator James Henry Hammond, he declared years ago that you dare not make war upon cotton. No power on earth dares make war upon it. Cotton is king. And yes, while that was true, I think the South kind of overestimated how much the world needed their cotton in particular, and while their self-embargo did negatively affect Europe, after Europe was able to find kind of other sources for this cotton, they ended up not being forced to come to the aid of the Confederacy, and ultimately the South's plan, their King Cotton Plan, was ultimately a failure. The Anaconda Plan was a strategy used, or at least proposed, fairly early on by General Winfield Scott, and that was to basically use the superior navy of the North to blockade many of the southern ports, basically in an effort to block them out of global or at least European trade. And it was honestly a pretty good strategy. The North had upwards of 95% of America's firearms and iron manufacturing plants. Like, the North compared to the South was heavily industrialized. So they had, factories and offices. They were producing and manufacturing metals and weapons and railroads. And the South, for the most part, was more, farm-based, agricultural-based. But the one benefit that the South did have was basically cotton. This massively profitable export, which the South could sell to places and countries all around the world. And then through that, they would be able to fund and make up for the loss of manufacturing plants of their own. And so the obvious counter to this would be to stop them trading. Because, if they're not able to sell this cotton, then they're not really able to do anything with it, except for make loads of t-shirts or something. And that is exactly what the Anaconda Plan planned to do. Sherman's march to the sea. So this was an incredibly brutal campaign and war tactic carried out by the Union General William Sherman. And it was a march basically from Atlanta to Savannah, designed to cause maximum destruction and to completely cripple the local area and Southern morale. And so they passed basically through from town to town, burning villages, burning houses and farms and barns, destroying telephone lines, and they destroyed upwards of 300 miles of railroad, causing in total around $100 million worth of damage. But through this long march, they freed around 25,000 slaves when and where they met them, which was partly at least their goal in doing this. Obviously the main goal was to defeat the South and to win the war and to reunite the Union, but yeah, they also freed a lot of slaves in this march. And there are, from what I've read, still a bunch of these areas that still, despise Sherman. They see him as a horrible, monstrous warlord, which I guess from the perspective of the South, he kind of was. I can imagine, like, you're just living in the South, you're just a humble person, you don't own any slaves, you don't really support slavery, but you just happen to be living in the States. Maybe you own a farm that your parents had, started generations ago, or I guess it would be like your grandparents. But if you've been building up this farm, you've just built a new barn, you've been saving up for 20 years to buy this new barn, you've got a few cattle, you've got a little farmyard, you're growing things, and then this general comes down, destroys your whole farm, burns it all down, burns all your crops, destroys your barn, destroys your house. And yeah, something that has taken generations to build is just destroyed in a few days. The South doomed from the start. So, as we mentioned earlier, the South generally depended on other nations for its survival, because you can't eat cotton. Well, I mean, you could, but it wouldn't really do you any good. And cotton as an export was basically their main selling point, or their main strength. So obviously by selling cotton you could buy everything else you needed, but the North didn't really need anyone for this. Like, trade was good for the North, as it is for most countries, but they had their own banking system, for example. They had decent roads and railroads built. As we mentioned earlier, they also had a lot of manufacturing capability, and they had roughly 4 times as many potential soldiers as the South, because the South had around 9 million people, or people of fighting age, whereas the North had around 22 million people. But within that 9 million of the South, around 3.5 of them, or 3.5 million, were slaves. And these slaves weren't really used as soldiers or armed in any way, at least until the very end of the war. So yeah, the North seemingly had almost every advantage. As we mentioned, they also had a stronger navy. They were able to blockade a lot of the southern US ports, or CS ports. And so the southern strategy and the southern advantage seemed to be one, early on they tended to have like better military leaders, like for example Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, who, morals aside, they were in their own right complete geniuses when it came to battles and warfare, that sort of thing. So in the early stages of the war, the North made quite a few blunders. And another advantage that the South had was basically what it meant to win the war, because to the South and to the North, winning were two entirely different things. The South could afford to be more defensive. You know, they weren't really looking to invade the North or take over. They just wanted their land. They wanted to be separate. And so, as always, just if you're defending a castle or something, it is always much more advantageous to be on the defensive side. Whereas the North, they couldn't just be defensive. You know, they had to actually march into the South. They had to take strongholds and positions that were already held by the South. And so that was always obviously harder. And since for the Confederate states, this was like, you know, an existential war, because if they lost the war, then the Confederate states would cease to exist, as they, you know, did in reality. But for the North, if they lost the war, the United States would still exist. It would just be smaller, it would be comprised of the northern states. And so I think mentally the North had much less motivation in order to fight really, really hard. Obviously they did still fight hard, they ended up winning the war, and that's, you know, that's all history. But these were just some of the, you know, even if they're minor, these were just some of the advantages that the South had. And on top of that, if the King Cotton strategy had worked, and the South had brought in, you know, maybe Britain, maybe France into the war on their side, and if the South had won a few more decisive victories fairly early on, they might very well have been able to negotiate some sort of settlement, some end to the war, granting them their own, you know, independence. And all of that is, you know, it's quite a stretch. I think if you speak to any serious historian, they would tell you that the South never really was super close to winning the war, and it's very possible that they would never have won the war under any circumstances, unless the South had time travelers from the future and they were able to come back and give the South automatic rifles, thereby winning them the war, which was actually a scenario from one of the alternate histories that I covered. So very fun stuff. Ultimate History Iceberg in the link in the description down below. But yeah, the actual realistic prospect of the South winning the war, I think, was probably a little bit unlikely. Andersonville Prison. So this was a prisoner of war camp in Andersonville in Georgia, run by the Confederate captain Henry Wurz, who was, after the war, tried and executed for war crimes. And part of these crimes were the fact that this prison camp was completely overpopulated. It had like up to 4 times the regular capacity that it should have had, and it had insufficient and unclean water, a low food supply, and was just all round unsanitary, filthy, and had generally poor disposal of, wastage, shall we say. And because of these conditions, almost 13,000 or 28% of the camp's prisoners ended up dying. And this was mostly from scurvy, dysentery, and diarrhea. And Robert H. Kellogg, who was the inventor of cornflakes, and no, that was just a joke. That is completely not true. I apologize. But he entered the camp as a prisoner of war fairly late in the war, and he described his experience as such. As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. Before us were forms that had once been active and erect, stalwart men, now nothing but mere walking skeletons, covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feeling, exclaimed with earnestness, "Can this be hell? God protect us." And all thought that he alone could bring them out alive from a place so terrible. In the center of the whole was a swamp, occupying about 3 or 4 acres of the narrowed limits, and a part of this marshy place had been used by the prisoners as a sink, and excrement covered the ground, the scent arising from which was suffocating. The ground allotted to our 90 was near the edge of this plague spot, and how we were to live through the warm summer weather in the midst of such fearful surroundings was more than we cared to think of just then. Tier 2, the Emancipation Proclamation, didn't actually free anyone. So this is just, I think, a little known fact, or an unknown fact, because I certainly was misinformed before I did the research for this one. But the Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery in the United States. That was done by a constitutional amendment 2 years after the war. But what it did do was allow the Union Army to basically free the slaves as they met them in the South. Because the setup for the whole country was a little bit weird at the time. Slavery was illegal in most of the Union or most of the South. It was legal in the South, and then you also had slave states which were in the Union. So these were these 5 states. So they were in the North, they were on the side of the Union, but they also had slavery which was still legal. And the Emancipation Proclamation didn't mention anything about these slaves. So they were going down into the South, they were invading the South, taking their slaves, freeing them, but they said nothing about the states that, didn't secede and were still in the Union. And this also ties into another really kind of interesting legal loophole, I guess you'd call it, where typically during the war and, before the war, if slaves fled to the North, then the North was kind of obligated to return them because they had kind of an agreement. It was, a legal thing where if you had citizens of the South, i.e. slaves, and they went north, then the North would have to extradite them and send them back to the South. And so during the war, there were multiple slaves who did, in fact, flee the South and they went north. And the South asked for these slaves to be returned because by law, they kind of had to be. But there was this strange kind of legal approach or view where the North started to view these slaves as property, which is kind of weird because yes, they did see them as human beings because they were against slavery, but to get around this legal loophole, basically, if you're an invading army, say, if you're the North, you're coming down south, you are allowed to confiscate items, property from the South that they have used for war. So the North is able to, confiscate horses, confiscate cannons and weapons, take them as property for themselves. They wouldn't need to extradite and send any cannons that they take from the South. They wouldn't need to send them back down south. And so there was this technique kind of where the North would say, okay, if you treat slaves as property, we don't see them as property, but if you see them as property, then when we are coming south into your country, we will see them as property as well. And we will treat them just like horses. We will treat them just like cannons and weapons. And so legally, we're just going to confiscate them. And then basically, since they confiscated them, since they were in the North, then they ended up just freeing them. It was a very strange kind of loophole sort of thing where they didn't need to extradite them, but they also kind of needed to officially see them as property, which is kind of messed up, but I mean, if it helped legally free the slaves, then, that's fantastic. And yeah, as I said, after the North won the war, it was just 2 years later that they made a constitutional amendment, basically freeing the slaves all over the country and making it illegal for any future state to, endorse or run slavery. Why did the Civil War start? So I'm sure with this one, it's a very complicated topic. I'm sure we could talk for hours about this, but there's many reasons I think that people give for why the Civil War started, with the main one being that they wanted to end slavery in the North and they didn't want to in the South. Other people also have said, the North wanted in on the cotton business down south or something like that. But the official reason, at least that Abraham Lincoln gave, was basically to restore the Union. Because, spoiler alert, the North wasn't exactly super non-racist. Yeah, they had outlawed slavery, but it's not like they saw black people as equal. They weren't, all white knights. And it's not like they had invaded the South prior to the South seceding. It's not like they had said, look, we are so against slavery that we are going to march down to these states and end slavery there. They were kind of fine with it up until the southern states seceded. And obviously by these states seceding, this threatened the strength of the Union. And so even Lincoln himself has said, in various letters and speeches, he has said yeah, okay, we disagree with slavery. That's an issue, but it's not the issue. He said, he would rather be assassinated and killed than stand by and let the Union separate. And this is all further evidenced by the fact that with the Emancipation Proclamation, that they didn't necessarily outlaw slavery in the whole of the United States, and they didn't even bother going after the slaves in the Union states. And so the whole slavery issue, it was partly to keep France and Britain out of the war, because France and Britain were against slavery, and so it was a pretty good political tactic, I guess. You know, midway through with Lincoln saying, you know, we're fighting against slavery. So now if France or Britain go and support the South, it's like, you know, they wouldn't be able to get away with it in their countries, supporting a pro-slave nation like this. So it was smart for Lincoln to make this more about slavery. And also, by targeting just the slaves in the southern states, he also kept the support of the Union states, the northern states that still had slavery. And so, yeah, I'm not saying that slavery wasn't a part of why the Civil War started, or that it wasn't a important factor in it, but I think it's a lot more complicated than, you know, a lot of people believe, and it was certainly not like the sole reason was to abolish slavery. Monitor vs. Merrimac, or the Battle of the Ironclads, was a naval battle, the first naval battle actually, between two ironclad warships. And so this took place around here. The North was blockading the South, you know, as we explored in the Anaconda Plan, and the South was trying to break this blockade in and around Norfolk in Virginia. And on this day, the Confederates had this, the CSS Virginia, which was an ironclad warship built from the remains of a burnt steam frigate, the USS Merrimac. And so this ship, the USS Merrimac, used to actually belong to the North. So while fighting around Norfolk, they were basically losing, and they decided to burn their own ship and sink it, this being the USS Merrimac, and this was to avoid the ship being captured by the South. But the South did end up capturing it. They revived it, they, you know, dragged it up out of the water, and just like the mountain in Game of Thrones, they brought it back to life, they augmented it, they did some crazy boat experiments on it, and they turned it from a wooden ship into an ironclad one, so basically just reinforcing the outsides of it with metal, and then it was dubbed the CSS Virginia. And so that's basically how it came to be. And on the first day, the CSS Virginia destroyed two wooden ships of the North, which were the USS Congress and the USS Cumberland, and also nearly destroyed the USS Minnesota. And so she was just basically wiping the floor with these other ships. They were wooden, they were weak, she was bolstered, she was metal, all around her, you know, she was unstoppable. The cannonballs basically didn't affect her whatsoever. But as it was, night was falling, and so the South basically had to retreat for just a short while. And then when morning came, the CSS Virginia went back out to finish the poor wooden USS Minnesota. But during the night, the North had brought down their own ironclad ship, which was the USS Monitor, who positioned herself in between the two ships, essentially defending the northern wooden Minnesota. So it was kind of, at this point, a standoff between these two ironclad ships. They fought for hours. Neither ship's weapons could do any serious damage to the other ironclad's armor, and so it basically ended in a stalemate with each side retreating. And this one fight, this one battle, really was a major turning point in ironclad armored ships. And so almost immediately after the British and French heard about this, you know, how just crazy effective that these ships were, and they slowed down their production of fully wooden ships and started slowly producing more ironclad ships. And, you know, the British and French were researching and developing ironclad ships at the time, but this demonstration just kind of further pushed things along, further rushed them in this particular direction. The CSS Alabama was a ship built in 1862 in secret by John Laird Sons and Company, which was a British shipbuilding company in Wirral, England. And its building was arranged by a cotton broker in Liverpool, and this cotton broker had connections to the south because, you know, cotton, and under British neutrality law, because, you know, Britain was a neutral country at the time of the Civil War. They weren't really on anyone's side. And so according to this law, you were allowed to design and build a battleship in England on the provision that it wasn't armed or fitted with weapons until it was in international waters. And so that is exactly what they did. They built the ship, mostly, and then when it had sailed outside the British waters, they just started fitting it, you know, with guns and cannons and everything. And the motto of this ship was Aide-toi et Dieu t'aidera, which means in French, roughly, God helps those who help themselves, which for a warship is just perfect. Confederados was the term or the name for Southern Confederates who basically fled South America, or they fled the southern states in the United States. Okay, let's try this again. Confederados. They fled the southern North America Confederate States, that's not much better, but they fled from here to South America, mostly to Brazil, after losing the Civil War. And this was partly to avoid being captured or, charged or killed. And it was also to continue their slave-having lifestyle, as slavery was still legal in Brazil. And the Emperor of Brazil at the time, Dom Pedro II, he enticed the Southerners to come down, offering them opportunity and slavery and cheap land, as he basically hoped to attain some of the expertise, you could say, of the cotton growing South. And so he wanted to turn Brazil into like the new King Cotton of the world. And he said, yeah, you can still have slaves. Slavery is fine here. Like, just come down, bring your manufacturing plants. We'll give you a bunch of land. And that was basically his way of improving Brazil. And it is thought that around 20,000 Confederates went down south, and most of them settled around Sao Paulo in Brazil, where they founded the aptly named city of Americana. And a lot of their descendants, although they're kind of hard to find and spot these days, because you can imagine they blended in with the people. After 2 or 3 generations, their kids are kind of hard to spot. They all speak Brazilian or Portuguese. They've all just faded into the culture of Brazil, but a lot of their descendants are still in Brazil to this day. The Confederate double-barrel cannon. So, pretty logically, what's better than a cannon that goes boom? Well, obviously, a cannon that goes boom boom. And this was the double-barreled cannon invented by gunmaker Antonio Petrini in Florentine, Italy in 1642. And I know what you're saying, that was, hundreds of years before the US Civil War, but this early version of it created in Italy was more or less just conceptual. Like, it was never really practically built or tested much at all. And so, come 1862, in the Civil War era, a Georgian dentist, builder, and mechanic, he was all 3 of these things apparently. He just did dentistry in his part-time, I guess. But he took this invention, he took this idea, he basically expanded on it, improved it, fleshed it out, and actually built a practical version of it. And when he did this, he ended up doing several test runs, which he considered to be a complete success. But, looking back on them, they may have been considered total failures. But how Antonio had originally planned it was that you would have these 2 cannonballs, and you would have a chain link between the 2 cannonballs. And they would also be, the cannons would also be slightly angled outwards, so that when the cannonballs were launched, they would slowly travel further and further apart, and the chain link between them would then become taut. And then when it got wide enough, at maximum tautness, which you can't even see it on the camera, but when they were at maximum tautness, these 2 cannonballs, they would fly towards the enemy, and this chain in between would mow down the enemy, mow down the soldiers, mow down the horses and the war cats. And that, at least, was Antonio's vision. And so he was quoted as saying that hopefully it would scythe down enemy soldiers like standing wheat when it reached them. And so when this was built in the Civil War era, the first few firings of it were hilariously ineffective. The first test, they got the cannon, they aimed it at these 2 upright poles, and then they fired it, and one of the ignitions went off just slightly before the other, which, as you can imagine, if one of them goes off and then the other goes off, it'll create sort of like an uneven spinning motion. And that is exactly what happened. It was quoted as saying that it plowed up around an acre of ground, tore up a cornfield, mowed down saplings, and then the chain broke with the two balls going in different directions. And that was test number 1. Test number 2, the cannonball chain combo mowed down a row of young pines in a nearby field. And on test 3, the chain immediately snapped, with one cannonball flying into a nearby cannon, knocking down its chimney, and the other ball spinning off and striking a nearby cow and killing it instantly.
Oh my God in heaven!
And so yeah, those were the 3 tests. And as I said, Gilliland, who was the guy, designing and creating this, he considered these tests a great success, and then went to the Confederate Army and tried to sell his invention and weapon. But the Army basically, they tested it themselves, and they said they just found it lacking in any sort of use. They said it didn't actually work properly, or at least effectively. It just seemed to randomly destroy anything around it and just kill innocent cows, apparently. And so he never really sold his invention to anyone, and for about 25 years or so after the war, the cannon, it was moved around, it was bought and sold by various people in various places before eventually going missing and being found later in a junk shop. The city of Athens in Georgia then purchased it and placed it in front of the Athens City Hall, where it still remains to this day. H.L. Hunley. So this was a pretty cool submarine, a fairly early submarine used during the US Civil War. And you could say that it was kind of like a death trap for anyone who used it, because in one of her first test runs, she performed fairly well, but then she sank and killed all 5 members on board. They drowned in the submarine. It's not like the submarine actively killed them. We're not talking about sentient submarines here. But then on another test run, just months later, she once again performed well, but also, once again, she ended up sinking, this time killing all 8 crew members on board, including the main organizer and investor of the vessel, Horace Lawson Hunley, after whom the submarine is now named. And she was the first combat submarine to actually sink a warship, being the USS Housatonic, and maybe predictably, after this incredibly successful attack, she once again sunk, this time killing another 8-member crew team. So this was the 3rd time that she sunk, and the 3rd full crew that ended up dying because of this. She was later, in only the year 2000, so, very recent by historical standards. She was found, she was located in the waters, and she was raised up 140 years after she had last sunk, with her currently being on display in the H.L. Hunley Museum in South Carolina still to this day. The Free and Independent State of Scott. So this sounds like a title to an early 2000s parody film or something, but the state of Scott was a county in Tennessee, Scott County, and when all of the states, when the southern states were declaring their secession from the United States, Tennessee was actually the last state to officially declare theirs. And when they did declare it, East Tennessee was completely opposed to joining the Confederacy. But since Tennessee as a whole had voted to secede, there was really nothing that East Tennessee, or, in this case, the county of Scott, could really do in that matter. Unless, of course, they declared their own secession from Tennessee herself, and that is exactly what Scott County did. So Tennessee basically said, we're seceding from the United States, and Scott County said, you can't fire me, I quit. And so they voted with an overwhelming majority. They voted 541 to 19 to secede from Tennessee. And so by seceding from Tennessee, they were also in a way seceding from the United States. And so officially they became the free and independent state of Scott. Except, it was kind of official, locally, because the Union and the Confederacy, both of them didn't recognize their, independence of Scott. But they did essentially from that point out just completely side with the Union. They started helping them with stuff, sending troops over to fight for the Union, and the governor of Tennessee actually sent down 2,000 soldiers to Scott to try and basically quell this rebellion against them, get them back in line. But when these 2,000 soldiers got down there, they faced just a ton of pushback and fight from the residents of Scott, and after this, the governor just kind of gave up. You know, he thought there's much better places to put troops than this tiny place. It's like, yeah, whatever, just let them rebel. And so through the war, Scott was basically on the side of the Union. But they didn't officially rescind or, reverse their declaration of secession from Tennessee until 120 years later in 1986. So I guess for that entire period, they were the free and independent state of Scott. The USS Alligator. So we covered the Confederate underwater vessel, or, submarine, the H.L. Hunley, a little bit earlier, but this, the USS Alligator, was the first northern United States submarine active during the Civil War. And the precursor to this, the Alligator Jr., was honestly pretty funny. It was this tiny vessel created and designed by Brutus de Villeroy, who was a French ship designer, and he had basically built it and then tried to sell it to the United States Navy. But they basically didn't want it, and so he tried to sell it to a few others. Nobody really wanted it, and then he was moving it from dock to dock, sailing it down the Delaware, and he was essentially caught and stopped by the harbor police, with the two men on board being arrested. And they said, what the hell are you doing here? And he said the US Navy arranged this voyage. And then the harbor police checked this and they were like, no, nobody from the Navy has okayed or confirmed or ordered this. And then he was eventually like, oh yeah, I guess I lied. But this whole debacle basically got him and the submarine quite a bit of media attention. And so the US Navy did eventually look at this properly. They were like, fine, we'll take a look at your crazy little vessel thing. And they came to the conclusion, they told him yeah, it's a little small, it's a little slow, it's quite poorly built, but it's kind of a decent idea in general. So perhaps if you can come work for us, we will take your design, we'll make it bigger, we'll make it more efficient, we'll make it faster, and then maybe we would have something to work with. And so they retired Alligator Jr., which sadly this has never really been found. We don't know what happened to it. We don't know where it currently is. But they started to build out a larger, better vessel, the USS Alligator. And this new better submarine, it could carry 18 men on board. It could travel at around 4 knots or around 4.5 miles per hour. It also had air supplied down into it from these two tubes that basically floated on the surface of the water, and it combined that with an air filtration system. It also had what was called a forward airlock, which meant that the crew members inside the submarine, they could basically, leave the submarine, they could swim out, they could plant mines, they can, plant bombs, they could gather supplies or whatever, and then they could re-enter the vessel, all without themselves or anyone inside actually drowning. And so, yeah, it was a very cool little piece of tech at the time. But at this point, the vessel wasn't even called the Alligator. It was only dubbed that a little bit later on when a newspaper called it that. And that was due to its green color and its kind of long alligator-ness sort of shape. And so the name just kind of stuck. It became the Alligator, and then its predecessor became the Alligator Jr. But just later on that year, the Alligator was being towed from Port Royal in South Carolina, and while it was being towed, the ship crew encountered fairly bad weather. They had to cut the Alligator loose, and she sunk and still, sadly, hasn't been found to this day. The Angel of Maurice Heights. So this is a tale. It is a story. It is the true story of Richard Rowland Kirkland, who was a sergeant in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. And he and his fellow soldiers, they were all fighting the North in the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. And the battle's not super important, so we won't really dive into that. But the US soldiers attacked the Confederate soldiers who were up behind a wall at Maurice Heights. So since the Confederates were in a defensive position, the Union soldiers ended up taking heavy losses, and when the next morning came, they saw that around 8,000 Union soldiers had been shot during the battle, with many of them still being alive and lying there on the ground, wounded, dying, and dehydrated. And a bunch of Confederate soldiers were shot as well, but just much less. But neither side really wanted to risk going out into this, essentially no man's land to help a lot of these soldiers, because obviously they risked just being shot at from the other side. So Richard Kirkland, again, who was a Confederate man, a Confederate soldier, from the safety and defense of this wall, he decided that he wanted to help some of these men. And so he asked his command basically if he could go out and help them, and the command said no. So then he asked, look, if I go out, I can wave a white flag and then I can go help them, maybe I won't be shot at by doing this. And still his command wouldn't allow this. So Kirkland just decided, like, you know what? Rules be damned, risk be damned, sides, north and south be completely damned. I am going to go out and help these men. And when he was told that he couldn't wave a white flag before going out, he told his superior, all right, sir, I'll take my chances. And so he loaded up some canteens with water. He gathered blankets, warm, dry clothes, and some basic medical supplies. And he headed out without a white flag into the field with hundreds to thousands of men lying there, bleeding, wounded, dehydrated, and crying out in pain. Kirkland basically ran from man to man, giving them, warm blankets, giving them water that they badly needed, tending to any immediate, easy to solve wounds. And he did all of this in the middle of this battlefield where the Union soldiers, any of them, could have easily shot and killed him, but nobody ever did. Because it was said that when he went out onto the field, one man alone, there was no hordes of enemies, running into the field. There was no battle cries or gunfire or anything. It was just this single man. And when he went out there, everyone kind of recognized what he was doing and nobody fired their rifles. It was thought that they might start shooting at each other. Kirkland would be caught in the crossfire and then he would indirectly be killed. But through all of this, nobody fired a shot, and it was like kind of both sides allowed for an unofficial ceasefire in order to allow Kirkland to help a lot of these men, which was honorable in a way because most of the men he was helping were on the Union side, so, in theory, they were his enemy. And it was said that this didn't end, this ceasefire, it didn't end until he was able to help every single man on the battlefield that day. He did go on to fight a few more battles before he and some other men were basically caught overextended, and upon trying to retreat, Kirkland on that day was shot and killed, with his last words being, "I'm done for, save yourselves, and please tell my pa that I died right." The Confederate Native Americans. So as with the US Revolutionary War, in the US Civil War, you had American Indians on both sides of the conflict. In the Revolutionary War, most of the natives were on the side of the British, as they had promised to stop expanding their territory, so, great for the natives. But in the Civil War, especially for the tribes that were kind of somewhat in the middle of the conflict, geographically speaking, they were a lot more divided. And they generally, as a general consensus, they just saw this as a white man's war. And so I don't think they really had a horse in the race sort of thing. Like, they didn't really care which side won. It was really about, which side is more likely to win, which side is going to benefit us more after the war, or which side are we kind of forced to be on based on just our geographical location. And so, yeah, I think if they had an absolute choice, most of them wouldn't really have gotten involved anyway. And so, both sides were kind of saying to the Native Americans, they were saying, like, look, if you fight for us, we'll give you your own land. We promise not to invade you anymore. We'll give you funding. We'll give you, benefits to your homeland. We'll give you all of this. And these promises after the war weren't necessarily super stuck to, but the tribes that did fight for the winning side, who did fight for the North, they did receive some short-term benefits and promises after the war, whereas the Cherokee Nation and tribe, for example, who actually sided with the South, they were branded as disloyal to the nation, and they were stripped of their treaty rights, and because they were on the losing side, they suffered more material damage than any other tribe, with a lot of their homes and farms and crops, etc. being destroyed, and with them losing roughly 1/4 of their total population during the war. And both on the side of the Union and of the Confederacy, various American Indians rose to fairly high levels, either in politics or in the military. Like, for example, the politician and later general Stand Watie, who was on the side of the Confederacy, and the lieutenant colonel and military secretary to General Grant, Ellie S. Parker. The Gray Ghost was a very cool Confederate cavalry commander named John S. Moby, who was known for impressive raids, guerrilla-style attacks, attacking, enemy camps, disrupting supply lines, killing scouts, gathering information, and was dubbed the Gray Ghost just because of how damn hard it was to pin down and capture him. And one of the reasons for this was his ability to blend in with the local people. So, for example, they would do a raid on something, they would destroy a bunch of stuff, they would ride away, and then when they were out of sight, they would, pack up their horses, pretend to be farmers or locals, and would just be extremely convincing in doing so, which is just awesome. It's like when you blend into the crowd in Assassin's Creed. And after the war, this Confederate soldier actually became a Republican, who, the Republicans were the party of the North, and he worked as an attorney supporting Ulysses S. Grant, who was the president at the time, but importantly, he was the guy who used to be the commanding general from the North during the Civil War. So at the time Mosby was fighting in the war, he was basically Mosby's enemy. But yeah, he ended up basically supporting him after the war, becoming a Republican, and serving as the American consul to Hong Kong, and also did a bunch of work in the US Department of Justice. So a very, very cool military legend and record, and also a equally, I would say, impressive law record, after the war, and all round just an incredibly cool and effective individual. John Wilkes Booth was an early oil investor. So this is, I think, an interesting bit of trivia, and that is that John Wilkes Booth, who was the man who arranged to first kidnap Lincoln, and then he kind of failed that a few times, and so then he arranged to kill him, and actually did, famously succeed, but he was an early investor into oil during the Pennsylvanian oil boom in the 1860s. He had invested between $1,000 and $5,000. It's kind of a little unclear, but he invested this amount into an oil venture, which $1,000 to $5,000 in today's money would be worth around $40,000 to $200,000. So it was a pretty decent chunk of change. But this well was producing a small amount of oil, and so Booth's business partner basically decided to throw explosives down into this well in the hope that it would, blow open the hole larger and, create more oil coming to the surface. But what they actually did was basically just destroy the well. And so it just no longer produced oil after that. And so that was kind of a failed business adventure, or venture, kind of an adventure as well. But after this, he then decided to sell his shares in another well, being the Homestead well, as he thought, it's kind of a waste of money. Like, screw oil. This well isn't even making much money. I lost a bunch of money on the last well. And so he just sold out. And then shortly after he sold his shares, this well started producing around 500 barrels of oil a day. So he just completely missed out on two failed opportunities, and this, as well as a few other things, caused him to leave the oil industry in late 1864. And this was just months before he would go on to assassinate President Lincoln. So, would Booths still have tried to kill Lincoln, if his oil ventures had worked, if he had earned a ton of money from them? It's kind of a little hard to say. Probably he still would have killed Lincoln, because a large driving force between why Booth's actually killed Lincoln was, there was many reasons for it. One, Booth's was kind of a white supremacist who believed strongly in the South and slavery, for example. He also believed that Lincoln was a dictator and should be taken out, as swiftly as possible. And these are all beliefs which I doubt really would have changed much if he had a little bit of extra money. But, I mean, really, who knows? The Bayou St. John submarine was a submarine found in 1878 when the Bayou St. John in Louisiana was essentially drained. And when all the water was removed, they found this submarine down there that has to this day no documentation or evidence for its design or creation. And so we don't really know exactly when it was built, or who designed it or built it, or the plans or schematics for it. We just know that it was built for use by the Confederates, and it never really saw use, very likely, but it was clearly designed, it was built, it was maybe used in a few test runs, and it had seemingly been scuttled on purpose by the Confederates in order to stop the North getting their hands on it, getting, their hands on this technology. Tie elephants to Lincoln is an absolutely wild entry. But during the Civil War, King Mongkut of Siam, which was the name of Thailand at the time, he offered to send the North, to send Lincoln, 2 war elephants to help with the Civil War. And these elephants were trained, they were domesticated, and they could, King Mongkut said, be used for stuff like, carrying things, for lifting things, even serving in a battle in a pinch. And his hope was that the elephants would be taken by Lincoln, and then they would be released, they would go on to breed and multiply, they would be released into the American landscape, with them then becoming natural animals in America found in the wild. And Lincoln basically wrote back to the king saying, thanks, but no thanks. He said that steam engines and trains were much more efficient than elephants. He said, we've got all the transport we might need, but it is still just absolutely wild to think about what would have happened had Lincoln actually accepted these elephants from Thailand, and if they had gone on to breed and spread out into the wild. The whole Carbine affair was a massive scandal involving J.P. Morgan, the famous banker and financier during the Civil War. And what they basically did was they arranged to buy 5,000 damaged rifles, damaged carbines, off the government for $3.50 each, and then they basically refurbished them, they fixed them up a little bit, cleaned them up, dusted them off, so it now cost them a total of $4.25 each, and they ended up selling them back to the government under a government contract for $22 each. So the government, got rid of these old weapons because they were just seen as basically junk. They were cheap, they just got rid of them. And then JP Morgan arranged to have them cleaned up. The caliber of them was changed a little bit. It was very cheap work, really. And then because the government, always needs weapons during war, they were like, okay, damn, we kind of need weapons now. And then they were sold back to them for like 6 times the price that they had originally sold them. And these weapons weren't really great either. They were often known for, misfiring or exploding. And so, yeah, once again, just a prime example of corruption and racketeering, and as is evidence with this gun scandal, clearly some things never change. The Winans Steam Gun was an absolutely insane weapon. It was this steam-powered centrifugal cannon or gun. And so how it would work is that steam would power this mechanism inside, and it would spin round and just keep spinning, just like a wheel essentially. But actually a better way to imagine it might be something like a slingshot. So, you're spinning this slingshot round, and then as soon as you let go, the centrifugal force will kind of fire it outwards. And this is essentially how this cannon worked. So it had an arm that would spin round really quickly, and then a tube, and you could essentially drop ammunition into it, and it would all be loaded up, and then one by one with each rotation it would be spinning around. One of the ammos would fly out of the arm, shoot off, the other one would be loaded, and then it would shoot off. So it would essentially be shooting ammunition just like a regular cannon. And so yeah, it was a little convoluted. It had some theoretical benefits. It had, in theory, a higher rate of fire. Instead of having to, reload a cannon, stick in gunpowder, put the cannonball in, or put, the bullet in or whatever. So a very, very cool, innovating, interesting design and machine, I would say. But it just really wasn't as powerful or effective or accurate as a standard gunpowder one. And so soon after it was designed, it was built, it was tested, and then it was, almost immediately after this, it was decommissioned and just never used again. Hunt's flying machine. So speaking of interesting inventions and machines, this entry refers to this flying machine invented in the 1860s by, once again, a dentist who proposed to the Confederacy that the idea of a steam-powered flying machine could massively help them in combat, in logistics, for supply lines, etc., and stuff like recon. And this dentist said that it was an absolute miracle machine, if it actually worked. And the Confederate President Jefferson Davis did approve this machine, but due to a lack of funding and due to several design flaws, this machine was never properly built. And so we really only have it in theory and maybe in a few drawings, but I'm sure you can imagine this flying machine in all of its glory. The other Abraham Lincoln refers to Abraham B. Lincoln, who wasn't the Union president, it wasn't the famous Abraham Lincoln, but this was an Abraham Lincoln on the side of the Confederates, because they actually had their own Abraham Lincoln, who was actually a second cousin of the Union president, but this other Abraham Lincoln, this other guy, fought as a rank-and-file soldier for the South. The other Jefferson Davis. So, kind of hilariously, just like the South had their own Abraham Lincoln, the North also had their own Jefferson Davis, with Jefferson Davis obviously being the name of the Southern Confederate president. And this Northern Jefferson Davis, he was Major General Jefferson C. Davis, who served in the North during the war and was known as an absolutely deadly guy, a tank of a man and a fighter, and also for being kind of a monster. So, for example, he killed his superior officer during the war while he was unarmed after the two got in an argument. And he was never charged for this murder, but he was also known for trying and fighting really hard to basically capture slaves that had escaped from the South, and then either killing them, punishing them, or returning them back to their masters, where they would of course then go on to be either killed or punished. And so yes, he fought for the North, for the Union, but he seemed very strongly despised to the slaves themselves and was seemingly actively working towards their misery, their death, and their recapture. And just to add to this entry, this I think is a prime example or the divide in thought in slavery, not necessarily being a clean split from North to South. Because for instance, you had a bunch of Southern people who didn't support slavery, but might have wanted to secede for various reasons, for more independence, so the North wouldn't control them. And you also had a bunch of people in the North who actively supported slavery, but they just thought that the South shouldn't secede, they should keep the Union together, and so they were fighting to preserve the Union, but they were fully supportive of slavery. And this sort of internal dilemma occurred, I think, much more frequently than people might suspect. The last Confederates surrendered in Liverpool. So the US Civil War itself ended really in the mid to early 1865s, or mid-1865, but a Captain James Waddell, or Waddell, of the CSS Shenandoah was at the time destroying Union whaling ships. And this was mainly in the Pacific, also in the Arctic. And so since long-range communication was a little bit hard back then, James didn't actually know that the war had ended. That was until he was told that it was already over by a British ship in the Pacific. And he wanted to surrender, but he thought that if he headed back to America, he might basically be charged with piracy because, he was attacking Union ships, United States ships, after the war had ended. So his plan was to basically go from the Pacific, go down south around Cape Horn, and then across the entire Atlantic, where he ended up in Liverpool in England. And from there, he and his crew and his ship surrendered to the British authorities. And so the reason that he did all of this, the reason he made a journey so far avoiding all US ports, was basically he thought that if he was captured or stopped or whatever by US ships or at US ports, he might be, captured, arrested, taken back to the United States, and hang for piracy. So at the time, Liverpool in England, as we covered, there was that ship that was made over in Liverpool. And that was partly because Liverpool was somewhat sympathetic of the Confederacy at the time. You had a bunch of kind of southern money in Liverpool, and this was to do with cotton manufacturers, cotton imports, that sort of thing. And so he thought, look, if I go to Liverpool, they're going to be a bit sympathetic towards me. Also, Britain can help, argue my case to the Americans. And also, with Britain being a fairly neutral third party, he thought that they could more accurately determine his innocence and then convince the United States that he was innocent. And Britain, when he surrendered, they agreed to do this. James spent 2 years in Liverpool after surrendering, and then after all of this, he returned to the United States, once everything had cooled down, and he was never actually charged with any of his post-war attacks on US ships. But yeah, in general, I think a very cautious, probably very wise and sensible choice. It seems a bit dramatic sailing halfway across the world, but if it means not being hanged and tried for, piracy, then it was probably worth the journey. White House seances. So a seance is basically, where everyone in a room holds hands, they light candles, they often have some sort of medium in there, and it's basically an attempt to communicate with the dead. And that is a seance. And this entry basically just refers to the fact that Mary Todd Lincoln, who was the First Lady of the United States and obviously the wife of President Lincoln, she held multiple seances in the White House during the Civil War. And this was in an attempt to communicate, to speak with her 11-year-old son, who sadly died in 1862 during the war from typhoid fever. And it was said that Abraham didn't really participate in these, but that he ultimately supported them taking place, as it was a very harsh time. That's what his wife wanted to do. That was her way of grieving. And so yeah, pretty interesting, but still pretty sad. Jack Hinson, otherwise known as Old Jack, was a sniper who worked for the Confederacy during the Civil War. And by trade, he was a farmer, as I guess, most people were back then, or if not most, then a fair few people. But he was also an owner of a fair amount of land and people, as in slaves, with him owning a plantation named Bubbling Springs, along with his wife and 10 children. And the start of this tale, the start of this story is honestly pretty dark, because the reason Hinson first started fighting was his 2 sons, 17-year-old Jack and 22-year-old George, were one day they were out hunting deer when they were stopped and captured by a Union patrol. They were accused of being spies for the Confederacy, and they were killed, dragged back to the center of town, and then decapitated, with their heads being placed on the gateposts of this plantation as a warning to basically all of the Confederates in the area. So yeah, I just can't even imagine, 2 of your sons being beheaded and with their heads like just stuck on poles. And so at the age of 57, Old Jack dusted off his .50 caliber, which the one he owned was an absolutely excellent high-quality rifle. It was based on the Whitworth rifle, which is considered to have been the first ever sniper rifle. And his gun had incredible accuracy at long range. And so Old Jack, he took this rifle and he became what was known back then as a bushwhacker, which was basically just like a guerrilla fighter. They normally flew either solo or in small groups, and they weren't really connected to or supported by the actual military. But his first target as a sniper was the lieutenant who ordered the deaths of his 2 sons. And then he targeted the actual soldier who placed their heads on the posts. And then after this, the Union soldiers were like, was that mad Old Jack Hinson? Was he the one who killed these 2 men? And so they suspected him of doing these 2 hits. They didn't really have a massive amount of evidence, but they suspected correctly that they were retribution kills, and so they just decided to burn down his entire plantation. So yeah, in just a short while, he has had 2 of his sons killed and decapitated, assassinated 2 Union soldiers, and had his entire plantation and family farm burnt down and destroyed. He ended up evading capture all throughout the war, all while killing soldier after soldier, and it was said that he had as many as 100 kills, even though his rifle only had 36 notches on it. But apparently, according to legend, these notches were only for officer kills, with the additional 60 or 70 additional kills being just regular soldiers. And so that is the legend of Mad Jack Hinson. And we don't know if it's completely 100% factual, but either way, after the war he settled down again, and he wasn't really disturbed much. He ended up living a relatively peaceful life and died in 1874 at the age of 6'7". The Great Snowball Battle of Rappahannock Academy is honestly just amazing, and it took place on the 25th of February in 1863 during the war after a massive snowfall, and there were upwards of around 10,000 Confederate troops who were bored, who were excited about the snow, with nothing much to do, and so they did the only obvious thing, which was they arranged a massive fake battle among themselves, complete with flags and formations and charges and battle cries and regular troops and cavalry and commanders and everything. It was just like a real battle, except instead of the soldiers being armed with, guns and knives and swords, they were instead armed with snowballs. And it was generally the North Carolinian troops versus the Georgian troops. And I suppose it was a way to keep the soldiers sharp, to keep them a little bit warm, to keep them fit. Also to keep the commanders, keep their minds fit. Kind of like playing a game of chess, in between battles or something. And even though all the soldiers were using snowballs as weapons, there were still a ton of injuries. Obviously being from the charges, them tackling each other, and the rough and tumble, and getting hit with a snowball in the face. There was black eyes all over the place. There was bruises, sprained ankles, bloody noses. And it was said that the battle was so loud and realistic that the Union forces stationed nearby, over the river, they actually feared a charge and attack from the Confederates. But, no, this was all just a bunch of bit of tomfoolery, and one of the generals actually issued a command, an order saying that there would be no more large-scale general snowballing in his corps after this. And seemingly that was the last bit of snow-based fun that these men had, at least for the rest of the war. August Willich was, interestingly enough, a man born into Prussian nobility, and he was born in 1810. He served as a military officer in the Prussian army, and all the while he was ardently pro-communist, with him actually conversing with and criticizing Karl Marx for basically being too conservative. So yeah, Karl Marx himself was too conservative for this guy, and soon enough he emigrated along with a bunch of other German revolutionaries over to America, and he served in the Union Army in the US Civil War. And then he spent much of the rest of his life in the United States in Ohio, and upon his death was actually eulogized by Karl Marx. And yeah, that is the pretty short but also pretty odd story of August Willich. The Knights of the Golden Circle. So this was a secret society founded in 1854 by a man named George W. L. Bickley, and the goal of this secret society was to build what they called the Golden Circle. And so just imagine a circle being drawn here, and this would basically include both the southern states of America, but also it would include Mexico, Panama, and a bunch more land in both Central and South America and in the Caribbean. And the goal at this point in time wasn't really to secede from the North, but it was to keep the United States as one country, but to also invade these other lands to bring them into the Union, so as multiple additional states, and to influence them and set them up as slave states so that the southern slave states in America would look more like this. So yeah, you can imagine if the United States took over all of this land, all of these other countries, and they became additional states, then the North, the northern states, what would become the Union during the Civil War, they wouldn't have the power, they wouldn't have the population to outvote anything that the South wanted. And so that was the initial plan, to preserve the Union, but to just create additional slave states that would be able to vote in favor of slavery. So honestly, pretty clever, pretty sneaky as a tactic, as, you'd expect nothing else from a secret society. But soon, around the time of the secession and the Civil War, these plans kind of changed, and the group's effort became obviously seceding, but also doing damage to the Union in the North, and by doing so, fighting and strengthening the Southern independence. They also rebranded and changed their name to the Order of American Knights, and then, once again, to the Order of the Sons of Liberty, named after the Sons of Liberty movement during the American Revolution, which was basically an attempt to paint themselves as, righteous, just freedom fighters. We're similar to like the founding fathers, man. We just want peace and freedom. And so, as you can imagine, if the Southern Confederacy gained its independence and then started to take over more and more land south, it would essentially be the leading country in the world for the production of not only cotton, but tobacco, sugar, and it would be able to produce a bunch of coffee and rice. And so yeah, it would be a massive market economy, super productive, super lucrative in that sense, all basically riding on the back of these massive exports and of course of slavery and manual labor. But this secret society, they obviously didn't make it that far. The South lost the Civil War, and the KGC, which became the OAK and then later the OSL, they officially shut down and ended. And it is thought, not officially, because there's no official ties between these, but it is thought that secretly, unofficially, that the same members who were part of the KGC would later go on to found and promote and be members of the KKK, with, for example, General Nathan Forrest, who was the first Grand Wizard of the KKK, being a prominent member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Douglas the Camel. So this was a camel used by the Confederacy during the Civil War, and the whole story behind camels and the United States is honestly pretty wild. As a brief explanation, before the Civil War, there was a move, notably by the future president of the South, Jefferson Davis. There was a move by him as a major kind of pusher and supporter of the idea that certain parts of the country would benefit from camels. He said areas that were so arid and desert-like, horses and mules just wouldn't cut it. And so at the time, this was before the Civil War, this was around the 1950s or the 1850s, but Davis at the time was a senator of Mississippi. And then a few years after this, still before the Civil War, a few years after this, he was the Secretary of War under the Democrat president Franklin Pierce. But anyway, in these roles, he did many things, obviously, but one of the things he did was to push for the acquiring and the use of camels in the army in America. And so he organized multiple trips out to Europe, to Asia, basically buying camels and camel gear, mounts, saddles, that sort of thing. Also hiring and bringing back camel riders, camel trainers, camel breeders. And this was from like Spain, Tunisia, so Northern Africa basically, also Greece, Turkey, and eventually after multiple trips, the United States Army had 70 trained camels at their disposal. And in tests, they were found to be much, much better than horses and mules when trekking through specifically very dry regions. But importantly, when the South decided to secede, the US Civil War started, and the North, the United States, they lost Jefferson Davis because he became the president of the South. And since he was a major driving force and supporter of this project, the North just were kind of confused with the whole camel thing. They didn't really understand it. They weren't connected to it massively. And so they just used trains and they just used horses and mules. But for Davis, he knew all about the camels and he actually did use them in his army to his advantage. And so Douglas the Camel, who this entry is about, he was just one of the more famous camels used by the 43rd Mississippi Infantry. And sadly, he was shot and killed by a Union sniper while taking a short rest. And they apparently, the Confederate soldiers apparently found out who was responsible for this, and they just went out of their way to find this sniper and then to kill him, getting basically vengeance for Douglas. But after the war ended, all of the camels who were, formerly part of the army, part of the military, they were essentially either sold or released into the Arizonan desert. And this actually led to multiple tales of undead camels or camel ghosts, camel cryptids, like for example the red ghost, actually being spotted in the desert in America, which we have actually covered in our Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. So if you like camel-related mysteries, link, as always, is in the description down below, so definitely go and check that out. The Confederate Los Angeles man-eating hogs of Shiloh. So just a short one, but after the devastating Battle of Shiloh, there were an estimated 23,000 casualties over both sides. And in this area, in these Tennessee woods, there roamed many, many large, wild, feral hogs. And so after the battle, these hogs came out, they saw the dead bodies all around, they started feeding on them. Naturally, this brought, more and more hogs to the area, and a lot of these soldiers, a lot of these men didn't really have time to bury their troops. And so you had the horrifying experience, the horrifying sight of just hordes of man-eating feral hogs eating all of the dead bodies in this battle, which honestly must have been damn near traumatizing for many of the men to witness their fellow soldiers being devoured by wild forest pigs. Lincoln's Marxists is a book that explores the fact that a lot of communists and Marxists, even Marx himself, supported the North during the US Civil War. And this is, I think, a pretty simple entry. I don't need to go too in depth into it, but it's really just that the Marxists saw slavery, and especially the South, as supporting and perpetuating the pyramid-like power structure that they were trying to fight against with Marxism. So, they were against the kings and the czars and the dictators, at least in theory, and they saw the rich, powerful southern slave owners as basically the same as that. And they also saw the abolition of slavery as being extremely necessary to the communist utopia, and so, in large part, they did support the North. Andrew Johnson nearly assassinated. So Andrew Johnson at the time was the vice president during the Civil War, with the president obviously being Abraham Lincoln. But the plan on that night basically wasn't just to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. It was at the same time also to assassinate the vice president and the secretary of state. And obviously they, successfully killed and shot President Lincoln, and the secretary of state, William Seward, was shot, but he managed to survive his wounds. But the vice president, Andrew Johnson, wasn't shot because his assassin, or his would-be assassin, a man named George Atzerodt, he got kind of nervous, he got drunk, and so he never even attempted to shoot anyone. Lincolnia. So this was just part of a general plan to relocate a bunch of freed black slaves in America both during and after the Civil War. And there were a few different plans, but one plan was to send the former slaves, these free men, to send them back to Africa, back to their homeland, as the argument was, that is where they came from, they would be more comfortable there, they would be treated fairly, they wouldn't be discriminated against, they would be more successful. And so that was one of the major plans, with some of the others, with at least one of the others being suggested, was something called Lincolnia, which was this 10,000 acre area of land in present-day Panama. And it's honestly kind of wild. Lincoln invited 5 well-educated, well-respected black men from the North, who were men who were well-known, who were held in high regard in their local communities, and he brought them in for a discussion basically on the fate of Black America. And what he said basically was, and I'm basically just going to paraphrase and quote a bunch of stuff from his speech, so don't shoot the messenger, but he basically said, look, black people aren't good for white people, and white people aren't good for black people. Like he said, we have different cultures. The white people in America would discriminate against black people, and so he said it's in our best interest and in your best interest if we were basically segregated and lived separately. He said, we won't force you to live around white people. He said, it would be better for you if we gave you your own country and piece of land, that being this land in Panama. And he said this land, which would be called Lincolnia, he said it would need smart, intelligent black people to help run it, to help found it, maybe to set up some rules for it. And he said, you guys are all very clever, very well respected. You should go live down there. You should support this state, and it will be for the benefit of your people. And this obviously never really worked out. You know, Lincolnia was never really founded or built at all, but the group behind, you know, the group supporting it was the American Colonization Society, and they, both before, during, and after this, they were constantly working to get the black people in America basically their own homeland. And they finally did successfully do this with the creation of Liberia, which is still to this day a country in Africa. The South would have abolished slavery eventually. And this is kind of an interesting question and debate, I think. You know, it's an argument that can be made in many different ways, but the general idea is that what would happen if the South never seceded, or if the South had seceded but had won, or at least been neutral during the Civil War? You know, would they have had slavery for the next 200 years? I mean, probably not. Would they even have had slavery for the next 100 years, or the next 50 years, or would slavery have been abolished within 5 or 10 years in the South? Like, I think it's pretty unlikely it would have ended that quickly because, you know, a large part of the Southern economy relied on it. But I think something around like the 20 to 40 year range, I think that is likely when slavery might have been phased out in, you know, the Southern states, because more and more the Western world, you know, despised slavery. They were outlawing it all over Europe and in the British colonies. And so if the Southern American states wanted to be part of the West, if they wanted to be part of the economy and the trade routes and trade deals in the West, they, I think, very likely would have had to abolish slavery themselves, which means in theory, the South never really had to secede, and also in theory, the North never really had to push the South on this slavery issue. And, you know, of course they did, and of course it was a good thing that they ended slavery even sooner, but it is an interesting question of how long it would have taken them to end it themselves if they were never forced to do so. Champ Ferguson was a man who fairly early on in the war organized his own militia of men and basically just went around doing guerrilla warfare in the general Tennessee area. And he and his men were not bound by any military code or discipline or what have you, and so they basically just killed as many Unionists as they could, just wherever they found them, with Ferguson himself being said to kill just anyone. You know, sick, injured people in their medical beds. He would just stab them. He would kill old, disabled men who couldn't walk. He would shoot soldiers, civilians, random farmers, just basically anyone who supported the North. And after the war, he and his men just disbanded and they went back to their regular lives until he was captured, he was brought in, and he was put up for war crimes, of which he was convicted and sentenced to be hanged to death. One of only 3 men to be sentenced to death for war crimes in the entire Civil War. And when he was sentenced, he gave this statement, you know, about his sentencing, which I will read for you now. He said, "I am yet and will die a rebel. I killed a good many men, of course, but I never killed a man who I did not know was seeking my life. I had always heard that the Federals would not take me prisoner, but would shoot me down wherever they found me. That is what made me kill more than I otherwise would have done. I repeat that I die a rebel, out and out, and my last request is that my body be removed to White County, Tennessee, and be buried in good rebel soil. Lafayette Baker." So this guy was honestly absolutely wild. He was born in 1826 in New York, and, you know, he did various jobs over the years. He worked here and there, with him eventually working as a spy in the Union Army during the war. And during the start of the Civil War, Baker went to Virginia, where he spied on various Confederate forces, barely making it out alive, and soon he reported back to the Union general, a man named Winfield Scott, whereby he was rewarded for his information and promoted to the rank of captain. And for round about the next year, Baker ran the National Detective Bureau, sometimes known as the National Detective Police Department, Department from Washington, D.C. And it was said that while he did get results, he often acted with like little regard for the law and would sometimes use brutal interrogation tactics in order to get information from people. So he was effective, just maybe he wasn't incredibly legal. And what's funny is that his appointment to, this position was in large part down to a man named Edwin M. Stanton, who was at the time the Secretary of War. And while doing his work, Baker actually suspected Stanton of corruption, and so he went to work secretly wiretapping the man who had actually gotten him into that position. And Stanton soon found out about this wiretapping, and so he soon had Baker removed and shipped off to New York. And so that was basically that. Until Lincoln was assassinated, Baker was brought back up to Washington to help with the investigation, and within 2 days of being back in Washington, Baker and his men had made 4 arrests, and they had the name of 2 additional conspirators, with one of those names being the actual assassin, John Wilkes Booth. Booth was soon shot and killed while hiding out in a barn, and Baker received a sizable chunk of the $100,000 reward, worth upwards of $10 million in today's money. And from here, Baker's reputation and his legacy just kind of went downhill. He was fired from his position as government spymaster, and this was allegedly because the president himself, Andrew Johnson, accused Baker of spying on him. So this Baker guy just doesn't care who you are. Secretary of War, President of the United States, if he thinks you're corrupt, he's just gonna wiretap and spy on you, which honestly, I kind of respect. He later published a book about this whole affair, claiming that the Department of War had in their possession John Wilkes Booth's diary, which they weren't disclosing to anyone. And then after this, the Department of War came out and said like, yes, okay, we have the diary, here it is. And then Baker was like, bro, there's like 20 pages missing from this book, and Baker claimed that these 20 or specifically 18 pages, they provided evidence for the fact that Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War who fired Baker and who Baker had previously suspected of corruption, apparently these 18 missing pages linked Stanton either directly or indirectly to at least the kidnapping plan of Lincoln, but perhaps as well even to his assassination. And so yeah, a pretty wild dude, a wild case. Baker died just a few years after this from suspected meningitis, but there are some people who theorize that he was in fact poisoned, by some government higher-ups who didn't take too kindly to the fact that he might have been, looking into this and potentially finding out the conspiracy about who was linked to the killing of Lincoln. So, this might be one for my conspiracy theory iceberg, which that will always be fun when I finally get down to it. But yeah, at least for now, just a super interesting case, individual, and entry. Chlorine gas almost first used by the Union. So the first official use of chlorine gas in war was by Germany during World War I in obviously 1915. But the gas, the technology, it was available during the US Civil War, with John Doughty, a schoolteacher from New York, actually proposing the use of special artillery shells filled with liquid chlorine, and these could be fired, in theory, into Confederate holdouts. And when they exploded, they would essentially release this chlorine gas, and this would force the Confederate soldiers, away from their safety. And this idea was proposed because, as I said, it was never actually really considered or at least properly developed during the Civil War. But there is some, universe, there is some timeline in which you would have seen this sort of chemical warfare in the 1800s during this Civil War. The Elmira Prisoner of War viewing platforms. So this refers to the Elmira prison camp, often called Elmira, I think for very good reason. And this was a prison camp that was so overcrowded, under-resourced, and in just horrible conditions that the prisoners inside were starving, they were thirsty, and they were dying from all sorts of diseases and just everything. And so what do? in situations like this? Well, I mean, obviously, you build a little wall around the prison with little viewing platforms that civilians can come and view the prisoners inside. Okay, and so yeah, they built these. Civilians could actually go up to them, pay around 10 or 15 cents. They could go up to these platforms, rent binoculars, they would buy food from various vendors, and they would watch these starving prisoners, you know, do whatever it is that prisoners do all day. And it was basically just like a tourist attraction. Like, you would come in, you would take a seat, you would buy, like, you know, peanuts and slices of cake and refreshments, you know, water, lemonade, and it was just like a nice day out, you know. Oh, look at that guy over there. All while the prisoners inside were starving and dying of malnutrition and disease. And yeah, just a wild case. Stonewall Jackson was a hypochondriac. So Stonewall Jackson was honestly one hell of a strategist and commander. And this is, you know, completely aside from his political beliefs. He fought for the Confederacy, so in my opinion, not a great guy, but you can agree, disagree, whatever. But objectively, as a strategist in war, he was absolutely incredible. And without getting into his entire history, he basically grew up, he was a bit of a weird kid, and he was highly suspected, not back then, but looking back on him, people highly suspect that he was neurodivergent. And so he was just a socially awkward kid. He was obsessed with religion and stuff like order and routine and cleanliness. And he gradually made his way up the ranks until he was a commander in the Confederate Army. And he won just battle after battle, often with a massive numbers disadvantage. And he was also known to be insanely strict, forcing his men to march just huge distances. You know, they were some of the most well-disciplined men in the entire army, with a lot of the men he controlled coming to be known as the foot cavalry, because they were essentially akin to horses or to cavalry with how fast they traveled on foot. And obviously, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it just goes to show you just how quick a lot of these soldiers were. And that was all down to just the discipline and strictness placed on them by Stonewall Jackson. And he was first actually dubbed Stonewall. You know, Stonewall wasn't his actual name, but it was after he and his troops basically put up a fantastic defense against some Union troops. And so people kind of commented that his men were like just a stone wall that the Union Army couldn't get through, and so the name of Stonewall Jackson just kind of stuck. But on top of his likely autistic tendencies and his military prowess, Stonewall Jackson was also a massive hypochondriac. He was worried constantly about his health. He would also have these strange routines and these regular actions that he would take, which were apparently to the benefit of his health. Like, for example, he thought that one side of his body was heavier than the other, and so he would often raise one arm up, and that was so that the blood would flow from that arm into the other side of his body and hopefully, you know, balance out the weight of his body. He would also often sit perfectly, you know, with perfect posture, with a rigid spine, as he believed that letting his spine touch the back of his chair would cause his organs to become like misaligned and mess up his digestion. And he was also known to stand up completely straight for long periods of time, believing again that it would help his digestion, and also it would help his organs not be, you know, thrown around. He was also an extremely picky eater, with him, I think, famously refusing to consume pepper because he said it caused a weakness in his left leg. Because of course it did. I mean, this man might be onto something. So yeah, he had all of these weird tendencies. He was also very likely on the spectrum, and he died during the war after being shot by his own soldiers, who accidentally shot him as they mistook him for the enemy. And when he was shot, he, you know, did massive injury to his arm, and so his arm was amputated, with him dying just 8 days later from pneumonia. And Robert E. Lee, who was another famous general of the South, he was extremely saddened by Jackson's death, with him writing to him just before he died, saying, "Give General Jackson my affectionate regards, and say to him, he has lost his left arm, but I, my right." Robert E. Lee when he was alive, when Stonewall Jackson was alive, Robert E. Lee massively respected him as a commander, as he said that he had like this uncanny ability to take just a vague direction from Robert E. Lee and to implement it exactly as Robert E. Lee wished, exactly as he had imagined. Whereas with a few of the other commanders, Robert E. Lee would have to tell them explicitly, defend this area, but also leave this area open, and also keep in mind that I might do this, and so you need to be prepared to do this, and he would need to spell it all out for the other commanders. And so yeah, as a military mind, absolutely incredible. As a person, not so incredible. And yeah, also massively affected by hypochondria. So yeah, the more you know. The Dahlgren Affair. So this entry takes us over to Richmond, Virginia during the war. And this man, Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren, worked with a few other men and several hundred cavalry in a secret, speedy attempt to overwhelm the forces at the Belle Isle and Libby prison, and in turn to free thousands of Union troops. And this was done partly at the time, as we explored earlier, but some of these conditions, these prison conditions, were so bad that more than 1,000 Union troops in these camps were dying every single month. And they also had some intel that this area in Richmond may in fact be sparsely guarded. So it was a prime target for a lightning raid. So the raid took place. It ended up being a fairly quick, fairly decisive failure, with Dahlgren being shot and killed. But the interesting part of this entry, I think, occurred when Dahlgren's body was searched. And on him, they found these papers, these instructions basically, to not only free all of the Union prisoners, but then to arm them with weapons and flammable paraphernalia, and to have them burn down the entirety of Richmond. And then, as if that wasn't enough, they had planned to infiltrate the South and to assassinate their president, Jefferson Davis. So yeah, none of this plan actually came to fruition because the raid was a pretty spectacular failure. But the Southern troops, they took these papers, these plans, and they mass-produced news of them. They printed news about this, they spread it all over the South, saying that the North are all monsters, they plan to commit a war crime basically, assassinating our president, and all the while the North just completely denied that these were actually real plans. They said the documents were forged, they had never ordered this, and they said that the South had made these plans up as a way to spread mass propaganda against the Union. And it's honestly a little hard to say, which side is true, because from what I can tell, the papers very likely were real. They were produced by the North, these were the orders that they gave, but there are a bunch of theories that say that the prison raid itself was the only actual order given. And so while the plans may have been real, perhaps they included additional plans that were really just the extracurricular work of Dahlgren himself. The Daniel Sickles insanity plea was, in fact, the first ever time in American law history that the defense of temporary insanity was ever used. And it was really a very simple case. Daniel Sickles, who was a US representative from New York, he found out that his wife was cheating with a man named Philip Barton Key II, who was a US attorney for the District of Columbia. And after discovering this, Sickles approached Key, which was in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C., and this exchange, apparently, then took place. Sickles: "Good morning." Key: "How are you?" Sickles: "You scoundrel, you have dishonored my house. You must die." Key: "What for?" And then Sickles shot him dead. And I just wish these people talked like this, these days, like, "You scoundrel." But then Sickles turned himself in, where he was charged for murder, quite obviously. But his lawyers at the time, James T. Brady and Edward Stanton, who you might recall from the earlier entry, Stanton would later become the Secretary of War, suspected of corruption by the super spy Baker. But yeah, these lawyers argued that Sickles experienced a moment of temporary insanity, causing him to shoot and kill Key. And since he was temporarily insane at the time, he couldn't be held responsible or charged with this murder, which is just one hell of an argument. And it would be absolutely insane if not for the fact that it actually freaking worked. Sickles was found not guilty by the jury after just over an hour of deliberation. And this was in part to them basically painting Sickles as a strong, good family man who wanted nothing but to avenge and honor his family, and he was then released and lived the rest of his life as a free man. The St. Albans Raid took place in Canada during the war, where several Confederate soldiers made their way up to Canada and then followed a plan to attack the Union from the north, from Canada. So basically to come down across the border to attack a few banks, to rob them of all of their money, and then to cause, general chaos, attack some people, hold other people hostage. And this was in part to, obviously rob the banks, to earn some money for the Confederate South. And also by attacking from the north, they forced the Union to put some men at the border and kind of, in theory, forced them to fight a two-front war. And so they went in, they robbed the St. Albans Bank, they held people at gunpoint, they announced that we are Confederate soldiers and you are all my prisoners. And they then robbed the bank, they robbed the people coming into the bank, they took all of their cash, and they eventually were all chased off back up to Canada and were then arrested by the Canadian authorities. But although the Union demanded that these soldiers basically be, handed over to them, the Canadians, who were, at the time, they weren't Canadian, they were still a British colony, but Britain said, we are officially neutral, and so they decided that these Confederates, who were acting under military orders, they were soldiers in a war, their actions were valid acts of war, and so they decided not to hand them over to the Union. They just said, well, you're in our country, we are technically neutral, get out of here sort of thing, which obviously annoyed the Union to no end. But they did confiscate all of the cash that they took from the banks, and they returned the cash to the Union, which totaled to, in today's money, just under $2 million. The Angel's Glow was a very strange phenomenon that occurred after the Battle of Shiloh, where the wounds of soldiers in the cold, wet April of 1862, they started strangely to glow a bluish-greenish color. And the reports of these glows noted that the soldiers whose wounds glowed, like I've said this before, glue should really be the past tense of glow. It just sounds so much better. But the wounds that glue healed much faster and cleaner than the ones that didn't. So it was theorized or suspected that this little glow, it was suspected obviously much later in the modern time, but it was suspected that this glow was caused by a bacteria within the wounds, and this bacteria then helped fight off the infection and helped the soldier recover. Now, if that sounds absolutely wild, that's kind of because it is, and we're not entirely sure still if this is part myth, part legend, part factual, but there was a mini investigation into it back in the year 2001. And what they basically found was that there was a bacterium, which I'm gonna butcher the name for this, but it was called the Photorhabdus luminescens. I mean, that wasn't so hard. But this bacterium lives inside nematodes, which are basically these tiny parasitic worms who live in soil. And what happens naturally is that these bacteria, or this bacteria, it glows blue, which was the same color as the apparent angel glow. And then this glow is thought to kind of lure in bugs, and then the nematodes can latch onto the insect, and then they release their toxins into them. And yeah, they're basically parasites. They take over the bug, and by releasing these toxins, they kill any other microorganisms living inside of the bug. So the theory is that the soldiers who were injured lying in the cold, wet soil, they attracted these nematodes who were in the soil, and then these nematodes crawled into their wounds, and then they excreted their toxins, and instead of killing their hosts, because humans are much larger than bugs, what the toxins did is essentially kill all the other bacteria in the wounds of the soldiers. And this was thought to be sort of a natural antibiotic, and so it led to less men getting infections and to them recovering at a much higher rate. And of course, when the bacteria was in them, it ended up glowing blue, which led to this apparent, story, myth, and legend. Lincoln Death Visions. So this refers to the dreams or visions that Lincoln had just before his death, actually prophesizing his death. And he said, that he normally didn't really believe in dreams or really take much notice of them. But in the days leading up to his assassination, he told a few close people that he had this dream, which he said haunted him endlessly. He said the dream was him basically walking through a silent, draped White House, which it was normally draped something like this in a time of mourning, and he walked through the White House to the East Room where he saw a corpse laying down on a catafalque, which was this sort of thing. He then asked who was dead, and a soldier replied to him, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." So, yeah, pretty spooky. And he had this dream really just days before he himself was actually assassinated. Stonewall Jackson assassinated. So we covered Stonewall Jackson a little bit earlier on. The Confederate general who thought that one side of his body was heavier than the other side. But as we covered, he was eventually shot by his own men accidentally, which led to his arm having to be amputated and eventually led to him dying. But there is a theory that this, accidental killing was actually part of a planned assassination. And one of the reasons that they knew that one of his own troops killed him was that they did basically a super early, it was like a ballistics forensics test, where they took the bullet out of him and they basically compared the northern style bullets to the southern ones and determined that it had been fired from a Confederate rifle. But the idea is that somehow either some of the Confederate troops were bought and paid off, or you had Union troops who had snuck down, who were essentially spies for the North, who had, gotten some Confederate uniforms, some Confederate weapons, and they had made their way close enough to Stonewall Jackson in order to shoot and kill him in this secret assassination plot. And if evidence came out for this that said it was 100% true, I genuinely wouldn't be surprised, because there was a fair amount of evidence for guerrilla warfare, for spy work on both the North and the South. And it makes sense if you're trying to win a war and you have a very effective, commander like Stonewall Jackson. It makes sense to try and kill him, to try and, cut the head off the dragon, so to speak. I don't know if that's a saying. It would make, I think, for a very decent plan. British clothing manufacturers helped stoke the war in order to make a profit. So this entry and theory is regarding something called the Lancashire Cotton Famine. And to explain it, we need to go back just a little bit, back to the 1850s. And so it's the 1850s, the cotton and textiles business is booming, with the southern states of America producing, as we covered earlier, most of the world's cotton, around 80% of the worldwide supply, and as high as 92% of the cotton used in France. So anyway, leading up to war, the British textiles manufacturers, many of them bought up large stocks of cotton, they stockpiled it essentially, and then when the war kicked off, this all led, as we covered, to the southern states not being able to export their cotton, or, they kind of imposed it on themselves, and then the Union ended up blockading their ports, and due to this, there was now a shortage in cotton, and so the price of raw cotton went from 6 and a halfpenny, as they called it back then, or 6.5 pence, all the way up to 27 and a halfpenny. So a 4 times increase in just 3 years. And this mostly all settled down after the war and potentially led to a plot, which we will cover later, where Europe basically manipulated Egypt into becoming bankrupt so that they could take them over. But yeah, as I said, we'll cover that just a few entries down. But the theory for this entry is that the British manufacturers bought up so much of this raw cotton and they held it, and then they funded and pushed political figures in the United States, on both sides, on the North and the South. They pushed them into war, and then they worked on the side of the Union in order to, give people ideas, to influence them, to kind of whisper in their ear, it'd be a very good idea if you were to blockade the southern ports, and then they manipulated this. They ended up, successfully doing this, which they knew would cause a cotton famine, which they knew would raise the prices of cotton, and then because they had stockpiled so much, they'd be able to just sell it all at a super premium, which actually did happen, but it's just a question of whether these textile businessmen had actually planned it out, whether they had actually lobbied in the US to kind of stoke and start this war, or whether it was just kind of a bit of luck on their part. Washington's ghost at Gettysburg. So this was a legendary rumored sighting or appearance, phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, where the ghost of George Washington appeared to some Union soldiers during the war. And this was as they were all marching up towards Gettysburg. He appeared apparently to them wearing a tri-cornered hat, a bit like this one, and riding a white horse. And this apparently helped inspire the men, and it, according to legend, helped lead them to a crucial victory at Gettysburg. Confederate money in Lincoln's wallet. So this entry, this fact ties into a greater theory about Lincoln being a Confederate plant. Because it is true that inside Lincoln's wallet, on the night he died, they found a $5 Confederate note obviously from the South. And so the idea was, he was walking around with Confederate money. Someone had paid him off. This was sort of his bribe money, and he was secretly doing what he could to help the South succeed. And it's kind of funny, at the start of the war, the South started to print their own money because they obviously weren't going to be dependent on the North's money. And at the start of the war, the Southern dollar was worth almost the same as the Northern Union dollars. But as the war went on, due to the South slowly losing the war, and due to the South printing more and more, due to hyperinflation, the Confederate dollar lost between 90 and 98% of its value, meaning that although a Union $5 note would have been worth in today's money around $130, a $5 Confederate note would only have been worth around $10 or $15 in today's money, which, $10 or $15 in today's economy can barely buy you like a large Starbucks or a Big Mac or something. So yeah, this note was worth honestly very little. And to say that Lincoln was being bribed by this Confederate money, like I might understand it if they found 20,000 Confederate dollars on him. But like with this amount of money, it'd be like trying to bribe Donald Trump with like a 6-pack of Bud Light or something. But I think it's much more likely that Lincoln had just picked this up as a souvenir, because just days earlier, the Union Army had taken over Richmond, Virginia. Lincoln was down there visiting it. And so, yeah, I think it's likely he just picked it up, kept it in his wallet. It was an interesting kind of souvenir from the war. And I think that's probably as deep as it goes. Confederate dinosaurs is absolutely amazing. And this was, or rather still is, it is this tourist attraction in Natural Bridge, Virginia, where it depicts a dinosaur attack on the Union Army. And I did tell you it was amazing. I do not disappoint. But at the Dinosaur Kingdom, they have 30 dinosaur statues, all depicted in various poses. They have Union soldier statues. They have one of Abraham Lincoln. They also have a gorilla in a cowboy hat because, why not? And they are all fiberglass statues in 100% politically, or rather historically accurate positions and scenes. Trust me, this all happened. And the concept for this park came from a local artist named Mark Klein, who spent a bunch of his youth visiting a place called Dinosaur Land in Virginia. And so he basically wanted to recreate his own dinosaur attraction, but this time with the concept of the Union soldiers, or the Union Army rather, finding dinosaurs during the Civil War, then trying to tame them and use them against the Confederates, with the dinosaurs then rebelling or, fighting back against the Union, and that is where you get all of these crazy scenes. Mark Klein, the artist who created this, also created Foamhenge, which is a one-to-one recreation of Stonehenge, but made entirely out of styrofoam. And so yeah, he seems to have an attraction for the odd and quirky, which, I mean, absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, I kind of respect it. We need more weird, quirky people in the world. But yeah, if you live near Virginia or in Virginia, or if you are ever visiting, I think it would be an absolute crime not to go and visit the Dinosaur Kingdom. Booth lived until 1903. This is a theory that says when he fled and went to hide in a barn and then was shot and killed, that this wasn't actually him who was killed. And this theory mainly comes from a 1907 book written by a man named Finis L. Bates. And this book was entitled The Escape and this word of John Wilkes Booth, in which he purports that the wrong man was killed on that night in the barn, and they rushed his autopsy, they misidentified the body, and even though they knew that it wasn't really John Wilkes Booth, they did so just to, cover up any incompetency, any embarrassment that they couldn't actually catch the real killer. And he purports that the real John Wilkes Booth actually fled further south to Texas, changed his name 2 times, and then lived out the rest of his life in relative peace and anonymity before, taking care of himself in 1903. And as far as I can tell, this, while it is a cool, fun theory, it mostly has no evidence for or, grounding whatsoever. Like, for starters, the body that was shot on the farm that night, when they checked the dental records, the teeth did match the known dental records of John Wilkes Booth. The body also had a tattoo on it with the letters JWB that John Wilkes Booth was known to have. Several family members identified his body afterwards. They found a bunch of John Wilkes Booth's stuff on him, like for example his notebook. And also, he said, before he died, because the shot to John Wilkes Booth didn't just kill him immediately. He was shot and then he was dying and then he was brought out. And apparently before he died, he said, "Tell my mama that I did it for my country." And then he just died. But if you were innocent, if you were just a random dude, that's not exactly something you would say if you were just randomly shot and were dying. And I think the idea of John Wilkes Booth running away and living out the next 40 years of his life in anonymity in America is completely wild, because Booth was an incredibly famous actor at the time of the Civil War, which is another bit of information that is just completely wild when you think about it. Like, he did, theater shows, stage plays sort of thing, and he was what we would consider an A-list actor. So it'd be like Leonardo DiCaprio shooting Obama or something. Like, it must have been just absolutely wild news when it actually happened. But all of this is to say that I think these theories are a little unfounded about Booth. Almost certainly he did actually die in Virginia on that night in 1865. Slavery is the best form of socialism is a quote by George Fitzhugh, who was a socialist and a pro-slavery advocate during and before the Civil War. And he defended slavery in such a weird way that it's actually kind of fascinating. He said that while the North prized themselves on, freedom and democracy, all that this really did was lead to a capitalist system where the smart, rich, powerful people forced the poor people into jobs, into roles, manipulated and exploited them, and led eventually to a society of poverty, imbalance, inequality, and just crime and instability. And, in a free society, all of the people still had to pay taxes, they still had to worry about getting food and shelter and all of that. Whereas if you were a slave, yes, you didn't have freedom, but you did, in theory, have security. He argued that everyone knew their place, so there wasn't much infighting, there was less crime, it was also more socialist because it cared for the slave or the worker. It guaranteed them food and shelter and a job or, purpose. And since the slave owners were actually incentivized to look after their slaves, they actually treated them quite well, and it was a much more compelling system than the North had, which is honestly just one hell of a wild take. Why was Lincoln buried 17 times? So, Lincoln wasn't actually buried 17 times, but his body was moved 17 times over the years. And this was mostly due to his body being repeatedly targeted by grave robbers, with one case in 1876 being a plot to steal his body and then sell it back for ransom to, whoever, the North, the government, his family. And so in 1901, his body was moved to a vault in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Illinois, and it was just covered, just buried under tons of concrete to stop this happening again. And still to this day, that is where Lincoln's body remains. Tier 9, the Great Locomotive Chase. So this was an absolutely amazing tale where during the war in 1862, a group of men who were Northern spies, they devised a plan, a raid, sabotage, or a mission, if you will, to hijack a train in Atlanta, which was behind enemy lines, and to ride it all the way up to Chattanooga, basically destroying all the communication lines and railways along the way. And this was in an ultimate attempt to cut off the Confederate supply and the communication lines between Atlanta and Chattanooga. And one of the main reasons for doing this was basically to be combined with a ground or a feet on the ground sort of attack, like a physical military attack on Chattanooga. And so hopefully it was planned that the North would invade down into Chattanooga, and this secret sabotage mission would take place just before this from the south. And so the plan was capture a train down in Atlanta, ride it up to Chattanooga, destroying all the connections along the way, and then when the Union Army invaded from the north, hopefully if this all worked out, the Confederacy wouldn't have any connections or communications from Chattanooga down south. And so it would make for a somewhat or fairly easy conquering or taking over of this city, Chattanooga. So these 22 men, they snuck behind enemy lines, they dressed as civilians, they went down into Georgia, and then they just bought some regular train tickets. And I guess it was fairly easy to sneak around in those days. You just told people that you were a Confederate civilian, and then you could just walk around. But they boarded this train in the station, this train named the General, and they basically hijacked it, taking it and riding it north. So the Confederates on the train, who just had their train hijacked, they were like, yo, what the hell? We need to go catch that train. And so they chased after it on foot along the tracks, going north. And then after a while of this, they jumped on a handcar and chased it even further. And then they commandeered their own train, the Yonah, and then also switched to another train, the William R. Smith. And then due to a broken train track, they left this train. They again chased on foot. And all of this chasing, a lot of the time on foot, took place mostly over 24 hours. So this dude is just chasing after the train that got stolen from him for 24 hours straight, without any assistance or like deferring it to the army or something. It's like if someone hijacks your car and then you just sprint after them for like 24 hours. But after going on foot for the second time, he then took command of a train that was actually heading south. And so when he commandeered it, it was pointing the wrong way. And so he just decided to ride it backwards, chasing after these men. And now, while all of this was happening, since the start, since they stole the train, they were, as I said, slowly destroying, bits of rail behind them. They were stopping to collect wood and water for the steam engine, and they were also destroying telegraph lines. But as you can imagine, all of these actions took up time, and every time they did this, the train needed to stop. And so slowly, bit by bit, between the chase on foot and the handcar and the multiple commandeered other trains, the Confederates were slowly catching up to these Union spies. And every time the Confederates would try to call ahead, they would send out a telegraph to some of the stations further north. Every time it would fail because the spies were on their way cutting these telegraph lines. And so because they couldn't do this, every train and every station that these spies, arrived at, they were blissfully unaware that this train was stolen. And so eventually, as the gap closed more and more between the two, the Confederates were able to get a message sent north just before the spies cut another communication line. And also around this time, the spies ended up running out of wood and water, and so they couldn't run the train anymore. So they just decided to basically abandon it, and they all went and fled on foot. And within just 2 weeks, all of these men were captured, with many of them being executed for being spies. And after all of this, the army attack on Chattanooga ultimately failed. The train never made it up to Chattanooga, so this mission technically failed as well. But it is still a incredibly cool, I think, creative mission that is probably worthy of a film at some point in time, and that is the Great Locomotive Chase. Britain used the cotton industry during the war to bankrupt and occupy Egypt. So cotton, obviously, as we explored earlier, was a massive commodity during the US Civil War, with the southern states producing and providing upwards of 80% of the world's cotton supply. So with the Confederacy at war and with their ports blocked by the Union, where would Europe primarily get its much needed cotton from? And the answer to that is, well, Egypt. A lot of Europe, especially Britain, went to Egypt and they were like, yo, can you be our new cotton producer? You know, screw the southern US of A. We need Egyptian cotton. And since cotton was at the time in such high demand, the prices were great. And so Egypt was totally on board with this. You know, it'd be like if you got a massive pay rise at work, just like maybe taking out a new mortgage on a bigger house, taking out a car loan for a new car that you really like. You know, you have this amazing paying job now, so you can easily afford the repayments. Well, Egypt basically did just this. They took out loans from mainly British and European bankers, and this was to build infrastructure, railroads, ports, even creating the Suez Canal. Except, as we know, when the Civil War ended, the South started to once again produce cotton, so this flooded the market with cotton prices dropped, and it'd be the same as you essentially getting fired just a month after you get this pay rise. Except now you have a much bigger mortgage, you have all of these car loans that you can't afford. And this exact same thing happened to Egypt, with them being riddled with debt and them having to declare bankruptcy in 1876. And this led to Britain basically occupying Egypt in 1882 with a brand new, conveniently built and opened up route, the Suez Canal, cutting the journey time from Britain to India by as much as a month. And this, of course, significantly brought down shipping costs and further strengthened the British Empire at the time. The last Confederate wasn't human. So, just a little strange entry, but the crew of the Shenandoah, which was the last Confederate ship to surrender, in their final days, we covered it earlier, they were in the Pacific, they sailed all the way over to Liverpool, but they had brought, in some of their final days, on board their ship, a penguin. And they dressed this penguin up, they declared it officially a Confederate soldier, and then they just let it go free. And so, after every Confederate on the mainland had surrendered, after every Confederate on any ship had surrendered, this Confederate penguin, in theory, never did surrender. And so, officially, in theory, whatever, he or she was or is, probably dead now, it was the last Confederate soldier. George Clooney, Tom Hanks, Jimmy Carter, and Elvis Presley all walk into a bar. Now, but what do these men all have in common? Well, they are, believe it or not, all related to Abraham Lincoln. Tom Hanks is a distant cousin of Abe Lincoln, and this is through Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks. George Clooney is related through Lincoln's grandmother, Lucy Hanks. Elvis Presley is a distant cousin of Lincoln's great-grandfather, Isaiah Harrison. And Jimmy Carter, the former US president, is a distant cousin of Elvis Presley's, and so by extension of Lincoln's. And this reminds me a little bit of my Harry Potter Iceberg, where you find that like most of the characters in the series are distant or even like second or first cousins. But yeah, with things like this, I think if you go back far enough, most of us really would in some way be distantly related. Tier 10, Lincoln killed by European bankers. So this is, I think, a very deep conspiracy theory that purports that Lincoln was killed, his assassination was funded and planned and supported by European bankers. And this was so that they could prevent Lincoln and the US from creating a free and independent US economy. Because in 1863, during the war, the National Banking Act was passed, which really massively massively changed how money and banks functioned. Because prior to the Civil War, everyone basically just used gold and silver as their economy, or as their currency. And whether this was in the form of raw, blocks of gold or silver, or in the form of gold or silver coins, like gold eagles, for example, worth around $250 in today's money, which is just kind of insane. Like, imagine walking around with a $250 coin. You go to buy like a new TV or something, you just throw one coin onto the table. Yeah, that's my payment. But when it's made up of solid gold, you can kind of do that. But there was also the silver dollar, which was worth $1. There was quarters, nickels, dimes, etc. But all of the coins were made up of either silver or gold. Or, they had silver or gold in them, which determined their worth. But the National Banking Act moved to create a national note currency, which was the greenback that everyone, including private bankers, would be forced to use. Because notes, when you really think about them, are kind of just like receipts. So you would go to a private bank back in the day, you would hand them, $200 worth of gold, say, and they would hand you back a note or a receipt saying that, yes, confirming that we have received your gold and you can get it back whenever you want. And so you could think about it like this note from them was worth $200. And so if you wanted to then buy something for $200, you wouldn't necessarily need to go back, exchange your gold, and then buy the thing with the gold. You could, because the gold was being held in the bank, you could just sell this note to someone. You can buy something worth $200 with this note, and then they could take the note and go and exchange it for gold whenever they wanted. And this is technically how modern day notes work, except that nobody ever, exchanges their notes for any gold in the bank. Also, the currency isn't really backed by gold anymore, which is kind of insane. Everyone's gold stocks are depleting. Countries are just printing more and more and more currency. So nowadays, it's kind of screwed. But back in those days, the currency, the money, did have a direct link to gold and silver. But for instance, I'm not sure about the American notes, but on the British notes, it actually says on the note, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of whatever the note is worth. Let's say 10 British pounds. So the pound is like the currency, and this note just says, I promise to pay whoever holds it £10 or 10 of this currency. So hopefully I didn't confuse anyone with that whole ramble. But at the time in America before the war, random banks and private bankers and different states and all of this, they all had their own notes. And it was their way of, securing or guaranteeing security to whoever banked with them. And it was kind of strange because different notes would be worth different amounts depending on how reputable they were. Like if it was a very dodgy bank, a $5 note from them might only be worth like $1 or $2. Also, if it was very far away, if you were in Florida, for example, or they tried to buy something with a note from a New York bank, in order to get that gold, you would have to travel all the way up to New York. It was also harder to verify things, the farther away they were. And so, yeah, maybe a $5 note from New York would only be worth like $3 in Florida. And these aren't exact numbers, but it's just a general idea that it was kind of like the Wild West with currencies, with notes, and this government act tried to kind of normalize everything. There were over 8,000 different types of currency and notes in circulation, and so Lincoln passed this bill, this act, saying that, look, we're going to put out one currency, one government guaranteed note, and you're not allowed to just hand people random notes or make your own or whatever. Like, we, the government, have a bunch of gold. We will guarantee the value of these notes, and so you can just use them with your customers because ultimately the government is guaranteeing it. But that was the general idea for, the American economy. But these greenbacks, these new notes that were, released during the war, they didn't exactly work like that because they weren't backed by gold per se. Rather, they were backed by just a promise from the government. So a gold-backed currency is like me saying, like, I have this mug and you know that I have a physical mug, and so I can give you a note, an IOU mug, and you can come back whenever you want, exchange it for this mug that you can physically see, you know that I have. But these greenbacks were sort of like a speculation and investment in the United States itself. So basically they worked kind of like government bonds, saying like, look, we don't have the money or the gold to pay you right now because, we're poor, it's a civil war, things are hard, etc. But we promise to pay you in the future. And so if you believed in the strength of the United States and that they would win, you would give the government your gold, and they would use it to buy weapons and soldiers and armaments and all of this. And they would give you this note, and then after the war, you would be able to exchange it back for your gold. Or more frequently, what would happen is the notes would be used to pay northern suppliers and to buy supplies and to pay soldiers. And so you can imagine that this was a little bit of a risk, because if the United States lost the war, they probably wouldn't cease to exist, but their economy would be less because of the southern states having their independence. And so you can imagine a $10 note might be worth less than $10 if the United States lost. And so what happened was, when they released these greenbacks, say like a $10 greenback, the price of it, the street price, would fluctuate. It would go up and down depending on when the North lost or won any battles, because it was like, oh, are they gonna win the war? Are they gonna lose? Are they gonna stall it out? Like, what's gonna happen? But this whole thing was basically a way for Lincoln and the US to give a middle finger to the private bankers, because when the war started, as every single war does, the country in the war typically tends to take out some loans in order to pay for the crazy high costs of war and to buy new, ammunition and weapons and all of that. And so these European bankers, they offered to give the US a bunch of loans, and these loans had honestly some crazy high interest rates. And Lincoln thought that this would cripple and indebt their country for years to come and maybe forever. And so he said, look, instead of taking out these loans, we're going to raise money for the war in a few other ways, hopefully ways that wouldn't completely indebt our country. And so these greenbacks were a way of basically borrowing off their own citizens. So, they took money from everyone, they gave them these IOU notes, and so the citizens would be paid back, but importantly, during the war, the government would have more money to spend. They also raised taxes a little bit for the people, and raised money in a few more ways, but importantly, they didn't take out these massive loans from the European bankers. And this conspiracy theory purports that this is why Lincoln was, killed, because he strived for a free and fair kind of monetary banking system in the United States, and that is something that these bankers just couldn't allow. And that is all we have time for. So yeah, once again, back on these kind of historical icebergs. We will mix it up a little bit with the next one. I think maybe a ancient civilizations iceberg, or a conspiracy theory one, or an SCP one. I haven't really decided yet. I'll decide that in the next few days. But yeah, as always, I hope you are having a lovely day, week, month, year. Stay hydrated, eat a banana, and as always, thank you for watching.